Feminism isn't just one thing. Why the wave framework still matters. Third wave feminism, identity, agency, and the turn toward the individual. Understanding the different waves of feminism matters because feminism is not a single idea, strategy, or moral position. It is a long history of debates about power, inclusion, and what real change entails. Each wave emerged in response to the limits and failures of the preceding wave, carrying forward both progress and unresolved harm. Without this context, today's feminist disagreements can appear as personality clashes or generational infighting when they are, in fact, deeply rooted political tensions. Access versus transformation, protection versus autonomy, representation versus redistribution. Tracing the waves helps us see why certain arguments keep resurfacing, why no single wave solved feminism, and how earlier strategic choices about who to center, who to exclude, and what compromises to make continue to shape feminist politics today. The wave framework is imperfect and incomplete, but it remains a useful map for understanding where feminism has been, what it continues to get wrong, and why this conversation remains unfinished. Third wave feminism emerged in the 1990s as both a continuation of and a reaction against the second wave. By this point, many of the second wave's gains, legal protections against discrimination, expanded access to education and employment, and public conversations about violence and reproduction were formally in place. But it was increasingly clear that those victories had not translated into liberation for everyone. The dominant feminist narrative is still centered on white, heterosexual, middle-class women and treats race, sexuality, class, disability, and culture as side issues rather than foundational ones. Third wave feminism arose from that frustration. It rejected the idea that there was a single, universal woman's experience and insisted instead on plurality, contradiction, and self-definition. Rather than asking women to fit into a shared political identity, it asked feminism to make room for difference, even when that difference was messy, uncomfortable, or resistant to consensus. What third wave feminism took on. At its best, third wave feminism expanded the scope of feminist analysis in critical ways. It foregrounded intersectionality, a framework developed by Black feminists to explain how race, gender, class, and other systems of power intersect, though the term itself was often flattened or stripped of its political roots as it entered mainstream feminist discourse. Third wave feminists pushed for recognition of queer and trans identities, challenged rigid definitions of womanhood, and rejected the idea that empowerment had to look respectable, palatable, or morally approved. This wave also reclaimed conversations about sexual agency, pleasure, and desire, where earlier feminist debates often centered on harm, risk, and protection. Third wave feminism insisted that women could be subjects of desire rather than merely objects of it. Choice, self-expression, and bodily autonomy were emphasized, not as abstract ideals, but as lived experiences shaped by culture, identity, and context. How it differed from the second wave. Third wave feminism marked a clear departure from the second wave's tendency to universalize women's experiences. It was skeptical of rigid ideology, centralized leadership, and single-issue frameworks. Instead of insisting on shared political conclusions, it embraced ambiguity and contradiction. A woman could be feminist and still enjoy things that previous movements had critiqued. She could claim identities that didn't fit neatly into established categories. Feminism no longer demanded coherence. It tolerated, and sometimes celebrated, complexity. This shift opened important doors. It allowed more people to see themselves reflected in feminist spaces. It challenged the idea that feminism required conformity to a particular lifestyle, sexuality, or moral code. For many, it felt like a release from the constraints and judgments of earlier movements, the strengths and the slippage. But the same turn toward individuality that expanded feminism's reach also weakened its structural analysis. As third wave feminism emphasized personal narrative, self definition, and cultural expression, political critique sometimes gave way to personal branding. Feminism became something you were rather than something you did. Identity became a stand in for politics. Structural power, capitalism, the state, policing, economic exploitation often faded into the background. What third wave feminism left behind? Third wave feminism laid the essential groundwork for contemporary feminist thought. It normalized conversations about gender fluidity, queerness, pleasure, and identity. It challenged exclusionary definitions of womanhood and expanded the range of people to whom and with whom feminism could speak. These contributions were not cosmetic. They reshaped feminist culture and discourse in lasting ways. At the same time, this wave helped create the conditions for the commodification of feminism. When politics became personal expression, it became marketable. Empowerment could be sold, identity could be branded, feminism could be worn, posted, and consumed without requiring confrontation with systems of power. Third wave feminism cracked open the idea that there was only one way to be a woman, or a feminist. But in loosening the structure, it also raised a question that feminism is still grappling with today. What happens when liberation is defined primarily at the level of the individual, while the systems shaping those individuals remain intact? The expansion was real. The critique was necessary. The consequences were complicated. And those complications are exactly what the next wave and the pink patriarchy would inherit. Fund liberation, not optics. Your donation supports feminist work rooted in lived experience, accountability, and real-world impact, not polished talking points. The Pink Patriarchy series asks hard questions about respectability politics, corporate and nonprofit feminism, carceral solutions, and the gap between progressive language and real-world outcomes. By tracing these dynamics across history, policy, and lived experience, the series aims to move beyond feel-good feminism and towards something more honest, accountable, and liberatory.